We begin tonight with a story that's got all of Washington talking, or more correctly, whispering, at the water cooler. And it could be a story that everyone everywhere is talking about for a long time. But we just don't know, because there's so much we still don't know. And it's all about the unknown contents of a whistleblower complaint deemed urgent and credible by the intelligence community's Inspector General. And our reporting indicates directly involves the president. Michael Atkinson, a career official appointed by President Trump as the intelligence community's Inspector General, has told Congress in so many words that the administration is not allowing him to do his job. In newly disclosed letters to Congress, Atkinson said he wants to tell them badly because the matter relates to, quote, one of the most significant and important of the DNI's responsibilities to the American people. But the president's acting spy chief, Joseph Maguire, and officials at Bill Barr's Justice Department basically overruled him. The IG told Congress he was not being allowed to even tell them, quote, the general subject matter of these allegations, which we now know is the president. A former U.S. intelligence official told NBC News that, quote, this urgent concern involves a phone conversation by President Trump. The Washington Post reports that it involves presidential communications with a foreign leader and some kind of a promise. The president, via Twitter, did not deny the reporting, saying, quote, anytime I speak on the phone to a foreign leader, I understand that there may be many people listening from various U.S. agencies, not to mention those from the other country itself, adding, knowing all of this, is anybody dumb enough to believe that I would say something inappropriate? After meeting with Inspector General Atkinson today behind closed doors, House Intelligence Chairman Adam Schiff seemingly threatened to withhold funding from certain initiatives supported by the current acting DNI unless the whistleblower's complaint is disclosed.
We will look at whatever remedies we have, including when the Director of National Intelligence comes to the Congress for authorization to reprogram funds for one purpose or another. We will look to whether he is abiding by the law in making a decision about those requests. So we will use whatever leverage we can, but at the end of the day, we are determined to validate the whistleblower process to make sure that people can expose wrongdoing.
There are plenty of signs indicating this complaint contains something pretty significant, whether it's the Inspector General's efforts to inform Congress, the administration's efforts to thwart him, the reports linking it to the president's discussion with a foreign leader, or, of course, the president's own non-denial denials. But, folks, we haven't seen the complaint. We don't know which foreign leader the president was talking to, and we don't know what he said or how this whistleblower even found out. And perhaps the bigger question right now is whether we'll ever find out. And by the way, if it's something not to worry about, perhaps they shouldn't be afraid to disclose it. Joining me now with the latest reporting on the intelligence community whistleblower is my NBC News colleague Ken Dilanian. Also joining me are a couple of people with first-hand experience in the IC, John McLaughlin, a former acting director of the CIA, and Robert Litt, former general counsel for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. So I think I have three pretty good people on this. Ken, the latest now, what's the next steps to seeing where we are with getting this information?
Well, Joe Maguire, the acting director of national intelligence, who's really under fire here, is going to appear in public next week before the House Intelligence Committee at their request. But nobody expects him to talk in any kind of detail about this complaint because he's really hamstrung. And by the way, this is a former Navy SEAL who has been praised on both sides of the aisle as a straight shooter. And he's in a position here where the Justice Department has essentially decided.
It seems as if the Inspector General at first, during the first letter, implied that the DNI wanted to basically go forward, but checked with justice first.
That's right.
Is that the correct
Well, he's been
narrative?
criticized for doing that because some people believe that the law doesn't really provide for that. It just says that once the ICIG decides it should go to Congress, it's just a rubber stamp. But given that we know it involved the president, it doesn't seem crazy to me that the DNI, who works for the president, the acting DNI, would want to run it by justice, particularly because there might be a privilege issue. You know, presidential communications with a foreign leader might be considered confidential. There's a prerogative there. So when he did that, the DOJ apparently balked and issued an opinion saying, no, this doesn't fall within the narrow confines of that intelligence whistleblower law. And that's where we are. So he went today on the Hill and he was not able to talk in detail about the complaint.
John, McLaughlin, it's some sort of raw intelligence? What is the type of things that an intelligence analyst would be seeing that could come across his desk that would go, "Ooh, this doesn't make a lot of sense"? What are the types of intelligence gathering materials that this could be? Are these transcripts? Is this NSA stuff? What is it?
Well, in all likelihood, it's a guess here is it's a transcript of something the president said. These things circulate pretty freely in the White House once the president makes a phone call, or at least in my experience, if you're in the White House, it's not hard to find out what the president said on the phone.
And every one of these conversations with world leaders, it is always fully transcribed. When you were director, and is this the type of stuff that everybody was getting this raw material?
No, not everyone, but I had often been in the room, or colleagues had been in the room to advise the president and listen in on the phone call, and then the transcript would be shared with a handful of people. It didn't go broadly throughout the community.
The phrase urgent concern, is that a significant phrase?
It is a significant phrase. It's used in the legislation, and it's hard to know, because we don't know the substance of the complaint, what that is in this case. You know, and at the extremes here, if you're looking at on the extremes that would justify an urgent concern for the intelligence community, it would be the president revealing something about a source or a method and so forth, which he has the right to declassify. But there's a fine line here, particularly if you're getting into source identity and so forth. And then at the other extreme, on the privilege side, as they're asserting privilege, perhaps he said something of a policy nature that was egregious for some reason, just making up something. What if he'd said to Putin, "Don't worry about Ukraine. I'm not going to give you trouble there."
And I want to be careful of like throwing out country ideas there, but yeah.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Don't want to give ideas.
No, I know.
Now, that would not technically be an intelligence matter. So it's the judgment of the whistleblower here about what is it that's worthy to surface here. So it's a judgment issue on many levels, at least 5 different levels.
Robert Litt, you've been a general counsel. First of all, have you ever did you ever deal with a situation like this?
No, I'm not aware of any time when this situation has come up. We obviously had a lot of dealings relating to whistleblowers, but we never had a situation where the Inspector General said this is something that needs to be transmitted to Congress, and the DNI refused to do that.
Boy, you say it very blankly. Are you shocked that the DNI did not take the advice of the IG here?
Well, I think John McLaughlin is exactly right. I think that if you assume that the reporting is accurate and this report implicates the president in some respect, I think it's prudent for the DNI to make sure that he's not out on that limb by himself, and to check and make sure that others agree that it's appropriate to send this on to Congress. So I can't say I'm shocked. And as you noted, I think earlier on, it's pretty clear the DNI and his people are trying to send out signals that this was not our call. This was something that we were told to do by the Department of Justice and maybe the White House.
Is it possible? We keep referring to this person as a whistleblower. And Robert, I want to start with you. Does this person right now have whistleblower protections?
Yes, this person now has whistleblower protections because this
How?
Because this person has done everything in accordance with the statute that John McLaughlin referred to earlier, the Intelligence Community Whistleblowers Protection Act, and the orders that President Obama and DNI Clapper issued for the protection of whistleblowers. As long as you follow those procedures.
Yeah. Are you saying if Adam Schiff subpoenas the whistleblower tomorrow, the whistleblower is not going to be breaking the law, disclosing classified information if they testify on the Hill?
Well, I think that's a really interesting situation. I would not want to be in the whistleblower's position there because this is one of those areas where Congress and the executive disagree.
That's where I was getting at, and that disagreement, Ken Delaney, and I assume limits Adam Schiff's. I think that's why he went to money. It's an acknowledgement. Right. A subpoena isn't really helpful here, is it?
I don't think so. Schiff suggested that he had a case and that a judge might act quickly on it today. But historically, the courts have been loath to referee these interbranch disputes. And so I think Schiff is right to talk about the leverage of the money. But look, there is a context here that, quite apart from this battle of the branches, the context is we have a president who's been contemptuous of the intelligence community and cavalier with secrets. He revealed classified information to the Russians in the Oval Office. I just checked today. Complaints to the Intelligence Inspector General hotline have more than doubled since Donald Trump took office. So there is a level of concern that we have not seen under previous presidents.
Go ahead, John.
You know, if this were what I would call a normal administration,
Yes.
There was a way to get through this. And in the statute, there's discussion of something called an accommodation procedure. Fancy word for basically getting together to figure out what we should do about this.
I had thought about this actually this morning. In a functioning relationship between the intel community and Congress, this feels like one of those moments where you would have gathered the Gang of Eight first.
Gang of Eight?
Right, which is the four leaders, the four major leaders of the Congress,
Yeah,
of both parties, plus the heads of the intel committees and their ranking members. And you say, guys, I know this is, and you hack it, you sort of hash it out, right?
Exactly. There's a dozen ways to deal with this in a normal circumstance. One of them would be to use the Gang of Eight, you referred to. Another would be to show this information to the chairman and the ranking and say, look, here's why we have trouble with this. And you can have this part of it, but not this part, and you can't have a copy of it. And you can work through these things, but there needs to be some bipartisan desire to work through them.
Bob Levin, I got to ask you this question. I want to put up a full screen here. This is the statute for the DNI's IG. Upon receipt of a transmittal from the Inspector General, the Director of National Intelligence shall, within 7 calendar days of such receipt, forward such transmittal to the Congressional Intelligence Committees, together with any comments the Director considers appropriate. I guess the question I have is, has the acting DNI broken the law here? Is he following the law? Or if he doesn't do this within 7 days, has he broken the law?
Well, it's always been the position of the executive branch, going back to both President Clinton and President Obama at the time they signed portions of this law, that despite the seemingly mandatory language of the law, this does not prohibit the president from exercising constitutional authorities to control the dissemination of classified information or privileged information. And so the executive branch would take the position that despite the language of the law, the president can say, no, you may not disclose this if he has a valid reason. And then we get into the kind of tugging back and forth and exercising leverage that you were talking about a minute ago.
Bob, I want to go more to privilege here a second. I had thought, and maybe I've misheard this or misunderstood this, I had thought when it came to our surveillance, if we were surveilling a foreign leader and we were listening in on their conversations, that the minute the president, if this was an NSA thing, and the minute the president was recorded, we didn't do it. You know, we sort of dropped it. It was considered privileged. It wasn't considered sort of raw intelligence. Is that not the case? Is there a special way that's handled when we're surveilling somebody that happens to be speaking to the president or a major cabinet member?
Well, I guess I'm not at liberty to talk about specifics of how we conduct surveillance. I will say that it's not at all necessarily true that this came about as a result of an interception of a communication. John Law,
fair enough.
Yeah,
right.
There are other ways this
right.
could have come to the attention of the whistleblower.
No, I guess what I'm saying, though, has there always been, without getting into specifics, is there a sort of a special way presidents and vice presidents are treated when you're conducting surveillance?
Yes, in the sense that you're not supposed to be going out and looking for communications of the president and the vice president. Your targets are foreign intelligence. But if you intercept, for example, two officials of a foreign government talking about the president, that may well be of important intelligence value.
Bob can't answer this, but two former intelligence officials told me today that the rule is if a U.S. official is on the line they're listening to, they stop. They cut off the interception.
That's what I had always heard. Is that not really policy, but sort of a norm, John?
It's certainly practice.
Yes.
You know, a lot of things in government are practice, and there's probably a regulation that governs that. I don't know what it is.
The larger issue here that I had heard, and I think one of the things that I'd like to surface here before we finish this conversation, is all of these episodes about leaking of American intelligence, whether it was what Ken brought up with the Russians, the fact that he put up that satellite photo with the Iranian, proving the Iranian, that, hey, look what we did to their launch pad, that this is served to do two things, John, I've heard. One is it's our Five Eyes partners are not sharing the way they used to. That's number one, our partners there. And the second is internal U.S. analysts are being careful how they give the president bad news.
I don't know the facts of those situations, Chuck, but I do know on the first point you raised about reluctance to share by foreign partners, I've had at least one personally raised with me the question of whether it's okay. And I've tried to offer some thoughts on how that person should think about it.
Right.
I don't know about, it's hard for me to think of the intelligence community withholding something from the
Withholding,
president.
I was told it's not a withhold issue. It's more of a how do you deliver it?
Yes, how do you deliver it? Certainly, fair enough.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're thinking about that. There's another important point in all of this that I think we can't miss, and that is all of this conversation about the whistleblower statute is probably going to discourage whistleblowing. In other words, if you're someone, and by the way, this is an important part of the intelligence world that intelligence leaders support because it's part of the morale of the intelligence
To make
community.
sure that they know that what they're doing, their job isn't going to, if they found some troubling stuff.
If you see something, say something.
See something.
And they tried to do the right thing here, and it didn't get out. People had to go to the media. That's the only reason we're talking about this, Chuck.
And it's all caught up in bureaucracy now.
Yeah, Bob Lippitt, is that what you expect now? Fewer whistleblowers?
I would hope not. I mean, you asked earlier, is this whistleblower protected? And the answer is yes, the whistleblower is protected. And we haven't yet seen how this plays out. It may well play out that the information comes out and appropriate action is taken. So I would ask people not to be discouraged now. And as John said, if you see something, say something.
And Bob is right.
Well, okay then. That's a good way to end it. Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.